All right, let's talk about acoustics, home studio stuff, acoustics. Let's talk about all that a little bit more. All right, so if you didn't check out the last video on my channel, please go check out the link in the description and watch that video if you want. Basically, what I was talking about is some of the basics of acoustics for people that are building home studios or working on improving their acoustics for either recording or music production or any of that stuff. So please go check that out if you want. And I'm going to be talking about some more concepts within that space today and just kind of continuing along the same thought process that we were in the last video. This is a part 2. I could have just said that. This is a part 2. So let's talk about building a sound booth. So if you're working on building some kind of a sound booth in your space, it's good to know that most live rooms or sound booths have like a 50 to 75% coverage in the space. So when I talk about coverage, I'm talking about like actual square footage on the wall coverage. So actual percentage of the wall that is covered by, for example, absorptive material, studio foam, something like that. And so if something is meant to be more of a live room with a ton of beautiful natural reverb, it's going to have a lower percentage of coverage. If something's more like a vocal booth where you just want a good clean recording with almost no natural reverb in it, then you'll probably want at least 75% coverage or more. And so that's how we get into the idea that a vocal booth shouldn't be this huge space. If you're just trying to get a nice clean recording out of it, it can be a very small space, and that makes it much more affordable to then get the coverage that we would need to get the sound that we would want. So I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't make sense in the comments below. You also might hear people talking about how dead a room sounds. And so basically when we say that a room sounds dead, we're saying that there isn't a ton of natural reverb in the space. So something like a vocal booth would be like the most dead option that you have, whereas something like a gymnasium would be the opposite end of that spectrum, right? Something that has a lot of sound bouncing around in it is not a dead space at all in terms of acoustics. So again, depending on what your actual purpose is for doing this, right? You might have a different goal than someone else. So if you're just trying to get a nice clean recording, for example, maybe you're just doing voiceover work or you're doing audiobook work, or even if you're just trying to record vocals and then add a nice reverb in the computer, right? Which is another option that you can do. Then you might just want to get a small space and get a ton of coverage on it so that you can have a fairly like dead acoustic space for recording in, and then you just record in that and work with that, right? And that might be great. If you're trying to build a nice, beautiful live room to record your drum kit in, for example, you might want to have less absorptive material coverage and might want to treat the space in other ways as well to help improve that acoustics. Now, another thing to consider if you're trying to set up a control room, so you're setting up something like a mix desk in your space, like what I have here, what I'm sitting at here, is something called the 38% rule. And so basically what that says is that if you put your desk in a space, ideally what you want to have is you want to have the desk at least 38% of the way into the room. So what that translates into is it's kind of feels like it's more in the middle of the room. You don't want it up against the wall, for example. So like in this space that I'm in, my desk is about 30 to 38% of the way into the room. And I can actually walk behind where this camera is positioned, and I can walk behind my desk, and there's like a few feet of space in there. You know, there's a good amount of space, even considering that I have the desk and then I have acoustic treatment behind it. I can actually walk behind, and I do regularly walk behind my desk. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you don't want to put your desk right up against the wall, because then, you know, your speakers that are generating sound, they're right up against the wall. Some of the sound's going to bounce back towards the wall and then bounce into your room, and that can cause trouble in a different way than it would if it was part of the way into the room. So this can make it very challenging for those of us that don't have a ton of physical space. We don't have a big room, right? Because sometimes if you put your desk like 38% of the way into the room, it's making the room very, very small and very, very cramped, right? So it's something to consider. A lot of people choose not to do this because that type of a con if you have a small space. But if you can manage to put your desk like 38% of the way into the room, then I would try it. And I would try it just as a starting point, right? Because it's not going to work. It's not like it's an end all be all rule and 38% is like the ideal for everyone, right? It's going to depend on your space and your size, your room size to some extent. But this rule does tend to work well as a starting point for most room sizes, for most spaces. And it is a great starting point. And what you can do is you can put your desk in a spot that's about 38% of the way through. Some people start like a little less than 38% just because it does make our rooms feel so cramped. And then you can listen, see how it feels, and move it slightly and see what the benefit is, right? See what the benefit is for these small movements back and forth and kind of settle on a spot that makes sense for your space. Now, the other thing to know is that ideally what people that design studios and design listening spaces and control rooms recommend is that you have your speakers set so that your tweeters are at about your ear level. So this is why a lot of times when you get some kind of a monitor stand that's like a freestanding monitor stand that goes from the floor up, the person helping you order or design the height of this monitor stand will often ask what model speakers you're using it with. And so that's so they know from the point of the stand where the speaker's resting up what the distance is between that and the tweeter, right? And then they also will often ask what your ear height is when you're sitting in your chair, because depending on your chair and your height, it's going to be a different height. And so ideally what we want to do is we want to have those speakers at your ear level. And this might be a little more advanced, but also depending on the speaker itself, sometimes there's a different ideal point for what should match your ear level. So it's something that you could also look up for your individual speakers. So like, for example, sometimes acoustic people will ask you not only for your model of speakers that you're using, your studio monitors that you're using, but they might also ask you what's the acoustic center for your studio monitors. And there's a reason for that, right? They're trying to get more information so that they can figure out what works best for your setup for you. Another thing to keep in mind is that ideally when we're sitting at our desk in our control room, we want to have an equilateral triangle between our monitors and ourselves, our head, right? So basically the way that works is if you go to the center of your monitors and you draw a line, I'm like reaching out to mine as if you can see my monitors, you're like in line with my monitors here. But if you draw a line from the center of your monitors and just kind of draw it back to the middle point, which is where you should be sitting, what should happen is the line that you draw should kind of intersect with your ears, and then the point should meet behind your head. So your ears should kind of be on that plane. If you draw an equilateral triangle between your monitors and your listening point, the center point in your space where your seat should be, right? The point of that line should meet behind your ears. So if you draw that line and you're sitting farther back than where it meets, not ideal. If you draw that line and that point meets way behind you, not ideal. You're sitting too close, right? So ideally, equilateral triangle, think about that. Think about where your head is within that equilateral triangle, and it should meet just behind your ears. And another thing that you can do besides adjusting where you're seated, right, where your head is relative to the speakers, is you can adjust the speakers themselves. So you can try moving the speakers along the line that is that equilateral triangle, the lines that make up that equilateral triangle. Try adjusting it slightly along those lines and see how it changes things, see whether it improves things. Same idea, you can take those speakers and adjust the angle of them slightly and see how that improves, if it improves things, if you like it. Kind of make these tiny adjustments to them and see what feels the best. Because usually if you take the time to make those subtle adjustments, you'll find that there's like one positioning that feels better, that gives you better results than the others. So adjust the angle, adjust the height of your speakers, adjust your seated position, adjust how everything is ever so slightly once you put it in that like ideal starting point and see how it all feels. So now another thing that I found interesting that I found over the years is the idea that some people say that there are golden ratios for control rooms for our mixing spaces. So I actually have notes on this. I don't remember where I got these notes from. I could probably go find it if you want. Just let me know in the comments below if you want to find the source of that information. If I do find the source of this information, I will post it in the description as well. But there are people who say that you should have a room ratio of 1 by 1.6 by 2.56 or 0.6 by 1 by 1.62. And so, for example, the first ratio, right? If you have a room that's 8 feet high, that would give you a room that's also 12.8 feet wide and 20.48 feet long. And if you have that second ratio, if it's 9 feet high, that would give you a room that's 15 feet wide and 24 feet long. So depending on your actual room shape and size, it may or may not be closer to like the ideal for a control room. So if you have a room that's very long and skinny, for example, it's easy to see how that can cause trouble, right? If it's like a hallway, it's not going to be as good for mixing in as a rectangular room. So one thing you could do if you do have the accessibility, the flexibility, the privilege of having multiple spaces to choose from, right, is if the space you're thinking about doesn't fit well to these ratios, to these concepts, you could then look around and be like, what other spaces do I have at my disposal that I might want to use instead, right? It's just a thought. Not everyone has that option. I don't think I even really have that option. So, something to consider. Okay, so another concept that I wanted to talk about is kind of interesting, and that's the idea of bass nulls within a room. So a null point is where it gets canceled out, right? So there are points in your room where the bass frequencies are going to be more likely to get canceled out. So, for example, the center of your space is considered like the biggest bass null point. So if you think about, the height, the width, the depth of your room, the center of all of that, which for me is like right back here somewhere, right? If you think about that space, that spot is going to be the most likely to have a total bass null, and you're not going to hear as many bass frequencies if you stand and put your ear right there as anywhere else in the room. In theory, it does depend on the room, right? So we have these bass null points. So one thing to consider is that we don't want to be seated within the bass null point, right? Or we're not going to hear our bass. We're going to be working. We're going to be cranking the bass, and then it's going to be way too much when we go elsewhere. We go outside of our space. So that's why, for example, we don't want our desk to be right in the middle of the room. We want it to be like 30, 38% of the way into the room. We don't want it to be at 50%. We don't want to be seated at 50%. And the one exception to that, this is kind of weird, right, is that left to right, right? Usually we're putting our desks so that if you look to the left and look to the right when you're sitting at the desk, it's the same distance from left to right. And that's mostly just because we want to have symmetry when we're mixing left to right. And that helps us understand the stereo spread of what we're working on, understand the left to right panning, stuff like that. So we do make an exception for the left to right dimension, but you don't want to then add to that problem by also being in the middle in terms of the height or in the middle in terms of the depth of the room. So we kind of make that left to right exception. But then another thing that we can do to help combat the issue is to use those bass traps that I mentioned in the last video, right? Because that can help minimize or reduce the effects of a bass null. But you can see how if, depending on the dimensions of our room, right? If you have a really small room and you place your desk at 38% of the way through and you just mindlessly put it there, and then depending on the dimensions of the room, if you're then seated at the 50% point, right? If it's a very small room, that could happen in theory, I believe, then you're causing trouble for yourself, right? And so if you then do that experiment that I was talking about where you move the desk slightly back and forth and you listen, you'll probably notice that if you bring it back more towards like 30%, you're getting much better results. And that's because you're not seated in that bass null danger zone, right? So the other thing with bass frequencies is the idea of room size, right? So we were just talking about room size a little bit. And I want to bring up the idea that small rooms are more prone to having modal problems. So that's why a lot of people will actually recommend having multiple subs in a mixing room. So this is something that comes up with like Atmos spaces a lot, right? But it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Because a lot of times the people that recommend having two subs, they'll be like, oh yeah, it could cause even more significant improvements in a small space than in a bigger space. And that's because small spaces are more prone to those modal problems, and adding two subs could help combat that in terms of, combating issues with the low frequencies. And so a lot of people will recommend adding a sub, right? If you have one sub, add a second sub in a small space and see if that helps fight some of the issues that you may have been dealing with. And that's also why some people will advocate for using even more bass treatment in a small space than you might use in a larger space. Bass energy often accumulates in a room and accumulates in the corners. And the way I think about it, I'm not sure if this is totally accurate, but when you have a smaller space, those corners are all closer together. So, using bass treatment, using those bass traps in the corner, maybe even more beneficial, more critical if you're in a small space. All right, so I think that's all I have time for now, so I'm going to cut it off, but let me know if you want to hear more about acoustics in the comments below. I was also thinking I could do another video on what to do when your stereo spread isn't translating properly or when your reverb is not translating properly, because the answer to that is a very specific acoustic issue that I would love to talk about. So let me know if you're having trouble with that, if you want to see that video. Just let me know in the comments below. You know, it's like, what do you do if you go to check in your car and it's like way too much reverb, but it doesn't sound like that in your actual mixing space? And I guess the other thing is, let me know if you want a video on actual materials that you can use for acoustic treatment, you know, because we can kind of nerd out a little bit about what materials do what and how they tend to be useful and how people tend to use them. So let me know in the comments below if you want to see that. And other than that, you know, do all the YouTube stuff. I'd appreciate it. Subscribe. That always helps. Check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/CatoNoise. And I come out with new videos every Wednesday. And thank you so much for hanging out. Okay. What's everyone doing for the holidays? I've been trying to figure out what to do for Thanksgiving, and I think I'm going to try to do a getaway. And yeah, I think I'm going to try to do a getaway. If anyone has any suggestions for like quick getaways in Southern California, please let me know, because I think I need like a decompressed type of getaway. I was thinking of going snowboarding, but there won't be snow on the mountains necessarily by Thanksgiving. At least not in Big Bear, which is like the closest place for me, and anything else is like a much longer trip that then, you know, I don't have enough time for that really. So I was thinking about snowboarding, but maybe I'll just go like decompress somewhere and read outside or something. That would be really nice. Yeah. Anyway, let me know if you have any suggestions. I hope you're all doing well. Bye.